Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Coaching Education for Para Track and Field as part of the Move United Leadership Conference. My name is Carolyn Stott, and I'm a program manager here with Move United, formerly Disabled Sports USA. We would like to thank the Bob Woodruff Foundation for their long-standing commitment and support for allowing us to bring you this virtual opportunity. For those who missed any previous sessions, recordings and session resources can be found on the conference webpage. This will be the same webpage you used to RSVP for this session. Before turning the show over to our speaker today, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees will be on mute to minimize distractions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to submit questions rather than through the chat. Feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourselves. Make sure to send your chat messages to all panelists and attendees to introduce yourself to the whole group. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cathy Sellers.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this. This is called Training Modifications for Paralympic Athletes. And the reason why we do that is because we know that we do not have enough coaches for all of our athletes around the country. So what this program is designed to do is to bring a traditional coach into the para world and give them an understanding of the different nuances for para compared to traditional sport. We talk about the stages of growth. Next slide. Oop. The next slide. We talk about stages of growth for an athlete, and it's actually, this time, we're going to talk about stages of growth for a coach. Coaches, typically, the first thing is, if they're a traditional coach, they have a fear of the unknown. They've never worked with an athlete with a physical disability. So there's a fear of the unknown. What do I do? Am I going to hurt this athlete? All sorts of different questions because they don't have experience with athletes with physical disabilities. The second thing is there's a fear of sometimes of saying something wrong. And there's no need to fear that because the athletes have learned or have adapted with a great sense of humor. And if you say something wrong, they'll easily and quickly correct you. For instance, I have a blind athlete, David Brown, and I'll say, David, did you see that? And he'll go, yeah, coach. Yeah, I saw that. So understand that there should not be a fear of saying something wrong. The next thing is shock. Sometimes you will see athletes that you wonder, how do they function? I have a quad amputee, and you wonder how he functions in the world, but he does a great job. So sometimes there's this little bit of shock for those coming into the disability world from the traditional side. The next thing is acceptance. The coach will either accept the athlete, and sometimes they'll accept the disability. And sometimes that acceptance happens at the same time. So the acceptance part is definitely, it's a part of it all. The next level is advocacy. Once the traditional coach sees what the athlete's going through and how they're looking for ways to help them. They're looking at ways, situations within their facilities, within their training, methods that they can adopt that will help that athlete through. The next part about Paralympic track and field is that basically we embrace every disability group. If we have the visually impaired, we have cerebral palsy, we have dwarfs, we have intellectually impaired, we have spinal cord injuries, we have traumatic brain injuries, we have almost any disability is embraced within track and field. So if we could go to the next slide, we want to talk a little bit about classification. So in classification, many of you probably know this, that for any competition, it's based on and let's use wrestling. Wrestling bases all their classifications upon weight. Some sports base their classification on ages. But what we in track and field try to do is we base it on impairments. We try to get like impairments. Swimming does theirs differently. Tennis will do theirs differently. Basketball, rugby, all of them, we all have different classification systems. Classifications are done by a trained classifier who is authorized by the IPC. They actually have a series of people around the world that will look at athletes and look at their impairment and determine what classification that they might be. And there are two levels. Locally, we do a national classification, and that gives us a framework for a kid coming into the sport. What is their class? What possibly group should they be training with? And then the next one is the international, and the international is what goes on for the games. Any major international competition, an athlete will have to be internationally classified. Those opportunities are limited. There's not very many. In fact, in the United States, we typically only have one international classification in a year. Next slide, please. So these are the types of classifications that we have. You'll see the VI up at the top, which has 3 different classes going from totally blind to having very limited vision. We have the intellectually impaired. We have cerebral palsy, stroke, and traumatic. We have two broad classes in that group. One group uses a wheelchair, the other is ambulatory. Then we have the dwarf classes. I will say on the amputee classes, they've changed the numbering system, and we'll cover that when we go through the amputees. But the numbering system for 42s and 44s are those who do not use prosthetics. And then the 60 classes are for those who do use prosthetics. And then the last group is the spinal cord injuries. It has a wide variety of spinal cord injuries. In the seated throws, that could also actually be an amputation. So these are typically the classes that we go through for track and field. Next page, please. So this is kind of just a visual. So you see our blind athlete with a guide, CP athlete down below in the red. Over on the other side, you see a series of amputees, both doubles and single legs. Then you have an arm amputee in the center, and then you have another class of arm amputees, which is basically brachial plexus. And what we're finding is that we have a lot of athletes that are competing at the college level in the brachial plexus class. Okay, next slide, please. So an 11 has to have a guide. I mean, they're totally blind, and they are attached to what we call a tether, and the tether is down below. And they have to use a tether, and there's certain rules within that tether. So the guide puts their hand in one loop, and the athlete puts their hand in the other loop, and it's kind of like a 3-legged race. So they're trying to keep together. They have to be in sync with each other. The guide has to be faster. So not only are you trying to pick up a blind athlete, but you also have to get a guide that's faster than the athlete, because this guide is going to be talking to them during the whole race. With some of these other classes, with the 13, particularly depth perception, night vision, color of the track can be an issue. Sometimes we see balance issues, particularly when we're teaching the ambulatory throws and if they're going to do a rotation. But typically, these athletes have developed an ability to work within their surroundings. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's important to realize is, how is this athlete affected? Particularly in the 12s and 13s. We know that the color of the track for a 12 or 13, if it's blue, the white lines, there's not enough variation. And so they can't actually see the lane lines. So there's things that you need to know as a coach about how their vision impacts them. How long have they been blind? If they've been blind at since a very young age, they've adapted quite well. If it's been acquired recently, let's say from an accident, particularly some of the war accidents, it's a little more complicated because they have not developed all the skills yet. What is a comfort level to try new activities? I am amazed at what they will do, and they will try anything and almost everything. And you have to be very cautious about what you do with them because sometimes they think they can do more than they can. The next thing is, do they have any other mobility limitations? The next is, do they have past athletic experience? Had they been involved in sport before? That's a real key for you. And are they conceptually familiar with some of the things that we will do? Different drills, catching a ball. Yes, I've watched them, a blind athlete and their guide, throwing a medicine ball at each other. Simply amazing. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about learning, their learning modality, which they feel most comfortable with. What is the dominant style? So there are 3 teaching styles, and this is not just for the VI athlete, but it pertains a lot to them, but for any athlete. Are they visual? Are they auditory? Or are they kinesthetic? There you go. So visual is very difficult with the VI group because their vision, they may not be able to see what you are trying to model for them. Auditory, for me, is very difficult because I'm trying to describe in a very clear and concise manner exactly what I want that athlete to do. And kinesthetics is the position that you want the athlete in. And in today's climate, you need to ask before you touch any athlete, is it okay if I touch you? This is what we're going to do. And you can go through it. So kinesthetically, the VI athlete works very well with that. And some things that you can do, you can either put the athletes, like if I'm teaching an ambulatory throw, I may touch their foot. And I'm going to say, I want your foot to pivot. And you actually pivot their foot so they get the idea of how it's pivoting. The next thing is, you can, as the coach, you can have them feel, let's say the same thing, feel my foot and feel the movement of the pivot. So, I'm getting a note here, okay. So there's different methods, and instruction always has to be clear and concise so that the athlete doesn't get confused. You cannot give too much information. Okay, next slide, please. We're going to skip the video. This presentation normally is about 1.5 hours to 2 hours long, so I'm really trying to condense it, but you will receive a copy of these handouts, and I really encourage you to go ahead and look at some of these slides. Question was asked, do we have a program for people who want to be classifiers? Yes, there is, and it's varied by each sport. And you would contact USOPC to get on the list for potential classifiers, but they want people who are in the medical field, physical therapists, OTs, medical doctors, chiropractors, etc. So on the teaching tips, let's go jumping. Blind athletes actually long jump. Think about it. You're going to run down a runway, which you can't see. You're going to take off at a board that you can't see, and you're going to land in a pit that you can't see. So you have to have a huge confidence level in the guide. So you want to keep, for safety reasons, of course, since the athlete can't see any of it, the guide needs to be responsible to make sure that all the equipment for that event is kept away from the pit. You don't want an athlete stepping on a rake or anything else. Make sure brooms, rakes, etc. are removed from the area. In fact, internationally, they've had to work on this because they like to put the camera close up, and we have wiped out cameras and sound bones. So it's important to keep all that away from the competition area. When you work with an athlete doing the long jump, you first start off with very short approaches, and you also teach them to count their steps. And they need to count their steps because that will tell them about where they are in the jumping area so that they can take off. Lex Gillette, who's the world record holder for us in the long jump, he knows exactly where his steps are, and 80 to 90% of the time, he is going to be taking off on the board every time. I have never seen him foul. So, guide and the athlete work together. The guide calls the athlete down the runway. Our preference is to stand in the middle of the runway between the jumping pit and the takeoff board. And then you work on the sound, and you may clap, have them clap as they come down the runway, and also use a key phrase that you're working on. And they have to work together. So the other thing is watch for any drifting in this approach. So sometimes the clap helps guide the athlete, but sometimes drifting will occur. So you have to watch for that drift. Next slide, please. Again, encourage you to watch the videos when you have an opportunity to, because that'll give you a pretty good idea of what these events look like in real competition. So, next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the intellectually impaired class. That's the T20s or the F20s. T stands for track, F stands for field. So it gives you an idea of what event that athlete does. So this was highly controversial when it first came out because people were saying, well, they have Special Olympics. Why can't the II athletes just go and do the Special Olympics? Well, the issue is that some of these athletes are well beyond Special Olympics. I'll give you an example. Michael Brannigan, who is the top T20 1500 meter runner, and he's fortunately from the US, he goes 3:45 for a 1500. So you're looking at a guy that's really fast. In fact, colleges were trying to recruit him until they realized that he was intellectually impaired. So the IQ for an II runner or thrower must be below 75. So there's a limit. You have to be 75 below. And INASFED, which is an outside group, and the IPC manage the eligibility process. Large number of potential athletes are in our public school system, but never have an opportunity to compete at a higher level. Question. So I'm sorry, I'm getting behind in the questions and answers. So are there any tips for correcting drifting in long jump? That's a drifting. What it is you go from one side of the runway, and as they're running down the runway, they slowly move over to the other side. And so drifting, to correct it, sometimes you have to use the position on the runway or the position of the guide because the athlete is running to the guide. Okay, so with the IIs, let's go to the next screen. You have to determine the effect of this disability on the athlete. Sometimes they will understand verbal instruction. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes they get really quiet or they get really nervous. Sometimes they get loud. Sometimes they get easily distracted. And in an international competition, you have to manage all of those. So you really need to know the effect of the disability on the athlete. The second question is, do they have social boundaries? Sometimes they don't have social boundaries, and that's something that has to be worked on with the parents and the athlete, and the coach has to assist in this as well to help them understand what is proper behavior. Patience on your part is a key. You have to be very patient and repetitious in your behavior and in the activities that you're asking the athlete to do. So repetition, repetition, repetition is one of the keys to helping them. And then having step-by-step plans, very simple steps, so that when they're under stress, they know what to do. And if possible, practicing these steps is a good key for them. So next, let's go to, we're going to move over to the CP. Tom asked a question, is there an age requirement for getting IQ tested? Okay, they have to be intellectually impaired before the age of 18. So a veteran who has TBI will not qualify as an intellectually impaired. They may, however, if there's a physical manifestation of their TBI, they may actually fall into the CP class, which is what we're getting ready to talk to you next. To obtain competition for intellectually impaired, how do you do it? Well, one of the keys is that they can actually run in traditional competition. There's no physical impairment. There's no adjustment that has to be made. So those who are intellectually impaired, many times they can compete in a traditional competition. Okay. The question is, can the classifier identify intellectual ability? There's a series, they do a series of computer tests and they do some physical testing with those athletes. That's how the classifier will determine it, but the paperwork has to be done earlier. And it's a whole very complicated, very expensive series of paperwork testing that has to occur. And we encourage our athletes to get that information from their public school, because many of them have IUPUIs, or no, I can't remember the exact term, sorry, but they have their plan, their school plan, and they've been tested. So they have the intellectual testing already done. And then that's verified by INSFED. And then next, they go right into the classification. We don't have that available for international classification. I mean, we only have it available for international classification, not national. So let's talk a little bit about IEP. Thank you. That's what I did. CP athletes, TBIs, this is the 30s class. This class is a very interesting class. It's a wide-ranging class. You go from a 31, which is the lowest level, and most of those athletes, in fact, all of them, will probably be wheelchair users, up to the 34 class, and the 34 class may be able to walk, but they cannot walk for a long distance. And so then you have different classifications within that. So then you have the 35, which is very similar to the 34. They're affected in all four limbs, but they choose to be ambulatory. The 36 is a different type of CP. It has, there's some hearing impairment. It's ataxia. 37s are usually a hemi, and a 38 is usually involved in a single limb. So you have all sorts of different classes built in within the CP. One of the things that the traditional coach has to realize is that they may not have total control of their movements. There are a lot of involuntary movements with these athletes. Some of the things that we have observed, stretching is extremely important. You're trying to reduce the impact of the spasticity. Volume, intensity, and recovery. So the volume that you do, how much you do in your training, how hard you do that training, and how much recovery has to be monitored to the level of spasticity. So you're, as a coach, you're watching to see the impact of your training on this athlete, particularly in reference to the spasticity. Stress is a factor in spasticity. So when you get to major competitions, the stress level can be really, really high. And so the CP athlete has to have some relaxation techniques that can be worked on ahead of time in order to reduce that stress and to reduce spasticity. The other thing that we found is that cold weather will have an impact on the athlete. Next slide, please. So we're going to be talking about the dwarfs and the amputees. In these classes, there's no training modification that needs to be made. We basically have two types of dwarfs. We have tall dwarfs and short dwarfs. And their training can be very little modification. In their weightlifting, you have to be careful because of backs and knees, which is typical for any athlete, but for dwarfs in particular. 42s and 44s are amputees without prosthetics, okay? And this could be a knee issue, a fused knee, a club foot, etc. Arm amputees, you have double arm amputees, you have those that are above the elbow, and you have those below the elbows. If the athlete is a 47, as noted, that's typically a brachial plexus or below the knee, a below elbow amputee, they are not eligible for distance racing. So they felt, the IPC felt that that was not a significant impairment for distance running. 61s and 64s, you have what we call AKs and BKs. AK is above the knee and BK is below the knee. And you have bilaterals and single legs. And they have now split those classes up, and they're trying to track the numbers based on the, that's why they've gone to the different numbering system. AKs above knee high jump they'll jump off of one leg, obviously, because that's the leg they have, and they may jump with prosthetic or without prosthetic. Typically, until Sam Grew, the US high jumper, came along, most of them were diving over the bar facing forward. Sam actually came with the flop technique and could handle that with his prosthesis. So that has kind of evolved that event differently now. Blocks for these groups are not required, but almost all of them will use blocks. Dwarfs only have throwing events, so they do not have a running event. What would a hip disarticulate be classified as? They would probably be, if they're a single, they would probably be the single leg above, they'd be a 63. Or if they're bilateral, they'd be a 62. So a hip disartic is above the knee issue, so that's where they would fall in. If they have a prosthetic, if they don't have a prosthetic, they would fall into the 61 class. Next slide, please. Okay, the 50s class. This is kind of a mixed class as well. It's a complete or incomplete spinal cord, spina bifida, or sometimes a neurological disease, for instance, like polio. And I know that we've all been concerned about the coronavirus, etc. But in the 40s, the biggest issue was polio. So what we're facing, I don't know. I think that polio was probably a more severe facing that we were dealing with in the 40s. Anyway, wheelchair classes, 51 through 54. 51 and 52s are quads. Typically, they do not have much function in their abdominals and also in their hand function. 53s and 54s are the para classes, and they have use of their hands and their arms, but in the 53s, they do not have the use of their abdominals. In the 54s, they do. So there's a difference in how they actually are able to maneuver in the chair and compete. 51s through 57s are the seated throws, and a classification for field can be different than a classification on the track, but they have to be within this. You can't be an ambulatory in one and a seated in another. So you can't be an ambulatory runner and then become a seated thrower. That's not allowed. But in the classes within the seated throws, you could be a 51 in the wheelchair and be a 52 in the throw. So one of the biggest issues that we have is that this quad class, because of their injury, have lost the ability to sweat sometimes. So we have to be very, very mindful of if they're sweating and trying to keep them cool so that they don't overheat. And another thing that's really important in this class is the strength to body weight ratio. The stronger they are with the less weight, the better they are in the pushes. We'll talk about the club in a little bit here. Any consideration of 50s with full spine rods? Yes. In the past, if you have what we call Harrington rods, the Harrington rod keeps you have to set up right. Now, I've been given a 15-minute warning, so we're going to have to move pretty quickly here. Let's go to the next slide. This is wheelchair equipment. This is just a basic. The biggest thing that you need to know is the push rim right here. All of this equipment is required, and the stops and the compensator. Stops set up, next slide, please. The stop will tell you on a curve how you set the curve. So everything else is pretty self-explanatory. Let's go to the next slide. Athletes have gloves and helmets. Gloves, there can be soft leather gloves that wrap around your hand, or you can have hard gloves. Hard gloves have become cheaper. Right now, they're making them with 3D printing. We'll see a lot of people grab the ring because they're wearing like baseball gloves. No, it's a different method of how you push. And if you'll go to the next slide. So these are positions that you're looking for. You'll see the push rim, you'll see the center axle, and the arm, when it's in the chair, the arm needs to be between the push rim and the edge of the tire. That's a good position. Next, please. The fist needs to fit comfortably at 7. If the athlete can't reach all the way with both hands to about 7 o'clock, then the seating position needs to be either eliminate some of the padding in the back or add some of the padding, or the push ring needs to be changed. Next slide, please. How to make the changes. Gives you ideas of how to make the change. And again, you're going to get this stuff, these slides in a presentation you can download. Okay, let's go to the next one. Let's talk about mechanics. So the contact is at between 1 and 2 o'clock. Okay, so you're making the initial contact between 1 and 2, and then the athlete drives down from 11 to 2. They're pushing and they're maintaining contact with it. And you can see that their hands, they're both using hard gloves. And the drive is down from 11 to 2 o'clock to about 6 to 7. Think of the wheel as a clock, and that will help you. So you can see the different positions. Next slide, please. The release phase. The release happens between 6 and 7, and the athlete is actually pushing from that 1 o'clock position all the way through the 7 o'clock position, and their hands are on the rim. All of these athletes you can see are using hard gloves. Then after 7, it's called lift and stretch. So you can see how high this athlete's arms are. They're getting ready to reload for the next stroke. Next, please. So with that, the arms, you've released and stretched. Your arms are coming back to the 1 o'clock position. You are going to drop down with if you have the use of your abdominals, you're going to drop with the push with your body weight and come back up at 7 and repeat the whole cycle over and over and over again. If you don't have the use of your abdominals, as the young lady in the blue, look at how high her action is. So she's getting as much as she can out of her arms to push straight down on the push ring. And in this last picture at the bottom, you will see all sorts of people in different positions as they're making the contact. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we're talking here about rotator cuff exercises. This is key for an athlete in a chair. You have to remember they have to have flexibility in their rotator cuff. because they use this in their day chair and they use this in their racing chair. And they also have an issue with concaveness. They like to, everything is in a forward motion. So any exercises that you're doing should try to expand the chest and open up the arms. Okay, next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit about throwing principles. The key here is movement is always slow to fast. A lot of people like to go fast in the ring, but it's slow in the beginning and speeds up at the end. In the preliminary movement, there's more going across a ring if you're an ambulatory athlete, or in the chair, you're trying to have your movement go horizontally and then lift at the end. And you're trying to apply force over the longest range of motion. That's a key. So you want to try to get as much torque, a term that we use, that means twisting motion in the chair, to get as much range of motion as you can. And then you're trying to transfer your body weight from the rear to the front, even in the seated chair. You're trying to transfer your body weight from the back to the front. Any error that starts gets magnified through the course of the throw. Next, please. So here are the rules. Has to be 75 centimeters for a seated throwing frame. And the reason why we're covering this is because this is different than the traditional part of track and field. Both legs have to be in contact with the chair at the ischial tuberosity, which is really your buttocks, the bone of your butt bones, your seat bones, and the back of both knees have to be in contact with the chair. Just says in contact. So if you straddle a chair, you still have to have both knees in contact. Let's go on to the next slide. So questions for chair design. Okay, can the athlete stand? Okay, they might want to be ambulatory. Does the athlete have use of their abdominals? That tells you if you need a holding bar or not. A leg bar that goes over the leg, or a strap that goes over the leg. Do they need that? Can the athlete control their lower limbs? We encourage the use of foot plates on all chairs because the foot plate either gives you stability or it gives you something to push on. If you're sitting in a chair right now, lift your feet up and try to make a throwing motion. Now put your feet on the ground and trying to make a throwing motion. You can see that you can actually engage other muscles by doing that. Is the athlete a high leg amputee? That's another thing that you might consider. And size, gender, and the ability of the athlete. Next slide, please. Different types. Here's a power chair. Okay, next slide. Here are holding bars, different athletes. You notice in the first picture that the athlete, that's called a dump, where the front is higher than the back. That's the only way, if you're going to have a dump, that it can be done. The front has to be higher than the back. It cannot be the other way. Here's an athlete in the middle straddling using a holding bar. Both legs and seat are in contact with the chair. And the last picture is facing forward with a holding bar. So these athletes don't have use of their abdominals, so this is what they're using. Next slide, please. Sometimes you don't need a holding bar, and a holding bar gets in the way if you have full use of your trunk. So you may not want it, because if you notice the actions here, these athletes are doing what we call a block, and if they had a holding bar, they would hit the holding bar. Okay, next slide, please. So here's a technique. Thumb is down, that's a key, and the arm and the body are at 90 degrees. Next, please. Whoop, picture's in the wrong place. But what you're looking for is you're looking for this angle. You want to see that the elbow is down. Next, please. Throwing technique. This is what we talked about with torque. There are terms called closed shoulders. That means your shoulder is facing the back of the ring. And so you're trying to get as much torque as you can. Some athletes, without the use of abdominals, have to kind of drop their body back to try to get as much. Remember, we're trying to get the longest distance for the throw that we can, apply the most force. And so that's what they will do. Okay, next. Lead with the elbow. Left arm leads up. This is in a blocking action. Okay, so what you're trying to do is drive the body up. Remember, our lift is at the very end. So we're trying to get our elbow up as high as we can. And to get that motion, it's in a straight line. Next, you start the block. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to stop. If you're a right-handed thrower, you are trying to stop the left side of your body, because otherwise all the force just gets turned. It's just turning. It's going around in the circle. If you stop the left side, kind of like a door jam, you stop the left side, all the force then goes to the right. We know that the speed of this action is one of the keys. Ron Davis actually did this study for us, is one of the critical factors for success, that in the seated throw, the speed of the action is a critical factor. Thank you all. You can email me if you have additional questions. My email is sellers, SELLERS, 10@live.com.
Great, thank you, Cathy, very much. And thank you everyone for attending this session on coaching education for para track and field. You will see a session survey in the chat and on your browser when you exit the screen. We encourage you to fill that out and provide us with any feedback. You can also stay involved in the conversation and share your thoughts throughout the conference on social media by using the hashtag MoveUnited. And feel free to pop over to Instagram Live at 1:45 Eastern and join Lily and I for a short movement session. We hope to see you there.